How do you know when you're about to interact with a certain party, a website, maybe through the transactional process if we're buying something through a known service provider? Well, the question that I have is, well, how do you know it's safe? Well, in this video, we're going to talk all things third party risk management and ensuring that when we're paying for something or getting a service from a partner or a service provider, we need to vet and make sure that we're managing risk when we're doing business with third parties. So, in this video, we're going to cover and discuss the different types of third party risk management. So, essentially, anytime we dive into third party risk management, just keep in mind that it's basically the process of discovering and managing risks within third parties. Now, across the business landscape, we've got maybe different vendors that we have to work through. Maybe there's different parties. And I'll talk about parties in terms of maybe there's contractors that we have to, involve, maybe technicians, maybe window cleaners, there's certain staff, and to keep things running across the business, right, through the business landscape. So we may have across different vendors that provide maybe, telco support for us, or maybe they provide us with, XYZ services. We've got to go through that process and ensure that we're coming and asking the right questions and vetting that process correctly with those third parties to ensure that obviously the documentation is obviously defined and outlined, and they're doing the right things when it comes to security and managing maybe our data and vice versa, right? So we need to understand what documentation we should ask for, as well as assessing the risk involved in potentially doing business with these vendors or these third parties altogether. So that's essentially it. We want to make sure, again, through our security policies, we've got maybe security training records, maybe even questionnaires. And yeah, I've been through my fair share of questionnaires that get sent to me through an Excel spreadsheet. And there's 100 lines of questioning asking how we manage our security, our cybersecurity posture, from data to incident response to compliance to risk. And there's all questions, and then you have to go away and answer all these questions quite meticulously to define what types of risks are involved, and obviously getting to the process of, well, if we're going to get into bed together and do work, what are we potentially exploring or opening ourselves up to in terms of risk. So that's the whole process around third party risk management, understanding that we have to do our due diligence and due care before we engage in any third party. Now, a common third party is something like a cloud service provider, right? So we've got a cloud service provider that we may utilize, whether it's AWS, which are the common ones. We've got Azure, and obviously we've got Google Cloud Platform. And there's obviously a couple more assigned to that, but they're just the main ones. So there's usually a shared responsibility with these cloud service providers, and they provide the responsibility for securing some of their systems and software and their services and infrastructure. And us as the customer as well, we're responsible for the other half of that. So in a moment, we're going to look at a table that I've sort of outlined around who has what responsibility across that shared platform service. If we're maybe utilizing a infrastructure as a service platform or a platform as a service, we have to go through that and communicate quite effectively around what's important and define who is responsible for what, right? So I'm going to put who is responsible, because we really have to define um, what we're going to do and what we're going to secure, but then we need to know who is responsible for that. Is this, you know, Amazon's side of things that they need to secure, or is this us that we need to secure it? And we're going to go through that in just a moment. So I'm going to scroll up, and this is a sort of a an outline around some platform offerings that I've got here. So we've got infrastructure as a service, and this is infrastructure as a service where we've got maybe virtual servers or workstations or firewalls, typically things in the cloud. And we have that operating system on those virtual servers or of the routers and the infrastructure. So typically we'll use, well, most companies will use an infrastructure as a service platform through a major cloud provider. Then we've got platform as a service. So this is building out applications on the vendor's platform. So the vendors will provide the platform for us. We'll go away and build applications that we can scale, based on, the usage and the consumption of those applications. And then we've got, so that's PaaS. And then we've got software as a service, where we use the cloud provider's application. So they'll provide us the application front, and then we will go in there and use that function. Could be a financial app that we're going to log in and use things with, could be a webmail function, it could be a laundry list of software components that we can just log into and use, thanks to the cloud provider. So that's sort of a breakdown on some of the ways that we can use these platforms. And these are areas of focus, right? So we're going to cover this in just a moment. So these are some of the questions around, what do we need to secure and who's responsible for this? And I've gone away and I've sort of, just put these down on paper just to make things easier as we're sort of going through this together. That way I don't have to sit there and write it all out. It's there now. We can just talk through it and understand it. So the very first part is the physical security. So if I just change pens, so physical security is something that is typically the underlying hardware, right? So we've got things like the physical security of the appliance, right? It's the actual data center, it's walking in there, maybe it's the physicality of ensuring that there's safety. And this is typically the providers um, have to go away and obviously ensure that there's security around the physical security of the actual data center and the appliance of that data center as well. So that's the vendor itself, so the provider here. In terms of hardware patching, so this is typically the underlying hardware of the patching. So the hypervisors patching all the stuff from the vendors, the locations of the vendor, and typically this is the vendor's responsibility around hardware patching of the physical appliances. So we've got our hypervisors, our servers, and typically that provider will be responsible for any part of that hardware patching because they are providing that as a service to us. So hardware patching is typically the provider's responsibility in this case. And then we've got our virtual management. So virtualization management. So this ties into the underlying hardware as well. So this is typically the provider as well. They're responsible for the virtualization of those platforms. And now we've got the operating system application patching. So if we're running an infrastructure as a service, so if we've got infrastructure as a service and we're building the infrastructure, well, then we're typically responsible for that. So this is going to be us here. We're responsible for maintaining the security of our applications if we're building out that infrastructure, whether it's the routers, the switches, the network equipment and stuff like that. We're responsible for obviously patching and supporting our infrastructure. Equally, where then the provider then will be responsible for both the platform side of things. So when we're using the vendor's platform, and obviously their own applications as well that we're going to then be supporting or be utilizing from the vendor. So they will then be responsible for ensuring that the security around the operating systems and the patching of those operating systems are up to date. Next part here is the firewall management piece. And this is typically when, if we were going to put in a firewall or intrusion prevention system of some sort, and we're maybe being, a managed service provider, that we're going to go maybe in a colo location and then, install our routers, install our switches, and obviously firewall equipment, stuff like that. Um, if this is going to be an infrastructure as a platform, so if we're going to go in and build that out for them, for our customers, I should say, right? So if we're providing that as a service, then we're responsible for the infrastructure as a service platform. So we're responsible for that management component. Whereas if we're building out obviously applications and the software component with the vendor, well then it's the vendor's responsibility. Now, in terms of policies, now this is a shared responsibility. We'll obviously have our own processes and our own documentation, and obviously the vendors themselves, so the provider itself, will also have its own policies around security and compliance and things like that. So typically, when we talk about the policy component, it's typically a shared responsibility across the board. We have to do our part as well as the vendor and the provider doing their part. And finally, we've got the data encryption. So again, anything in terms of infrastructure that we're building out, we're responsible for ensuring that that's obviously enabled and turned on. So typically us, we're responsible for ensuring the data confidentiality and encryption. If we're building out applications on the vendor's platform, then yes, absolutely, we're going to have to be responsible for that as well. And then finally, if we're using the vendor's applications like webmail or some login portals or pages that we're going to have to log into, and they're providing that as a service to us, well, then the customer, or in that case, the provider, will then have to be, you change colors, the provider will then have to be responsible for that component. So they'll have to ensure that that data, the data encryption has obviously been turned on and is in use. So that's typically, some areas of focus along some platforms that are being used today. The other component that I want to touch on as we sort of jump into more around the third-party risk management is the life cycle itself. So it just doesn't end, right? We don't just go in and do third-party risk management. There's a life cycle to it. It's an ever-changing environment. Things are always changing and we have to adapt and grow with our environment as well. So to the right over here, I do have our third-party risk management lifecycle. And I've sort of broken it down because there's a few areas that I'd love to cover. And the very first component around our our life cycle is the initial assessment. So I'm just going to put initial assessment. This is typically the very first step that we're going to look at. So this is us where when we need to assess the vendor and see if they're basically a good fit for us. If there's a suitability to anyone that we're doing business with, do they have certification standards that we need to maybe comply with, or they need to comply with, whether it's NIST, ISO, maybe it's a SOC 2 compliancy, and we have to obviously vet that process and ensure that there's one again that suitability is profound here because we need to ensure that as we're doing business together, we usually have or going to have some sort of vendor checklist that we have to hold them against, and obviously have them meet those requirements that we have to then do business together. So typically, it works out into a two-part process. Usually, there's an RFI, so a request for information, and then we've got an RFP, which is a request for proposal. This is where the vendor sends us back and forth some information because we've requested the information, such as things like, what they can offer us, the privacy standards, maybe security operations, and how that looks like, and what they're doing currently, and why they're the best vendor for us. That's typically around the justification why we should work with them, right? So it's a bit of information around sort of, why they're a good fit for us. And then once we pass that, then we move over into the next phase, which is typically, and I'll put over here, number two, and this is usually the legal side. And the legal component is basically the legal agreements, essentially. So this is things like, are we able to trust each other and maybe share confidential information with each other across maybe security and privacy? And this is typically around non-disclosures, right? We have to send each other information that's not publicly available. It could be standards that they have to follow. Again, maybe an ISO path, maybe a SOC 2, maybe the APRA compliant. And then we're going to have to obviously request some of that information that is probably confidential as well. So non-disclosure is usually the part that we've got to follow and ensure that's done correctly. And then we've also got that right to audit as well. If we want to audit them, then we can. We can have our own internal auditors, maybe audit that process, ensure that that we're doing the right due diligence and due care in nature with their obviously their security and their privacy and their data. There's obviously maybe things like incident response requirements as well, like notifications. If they have an incident, will they notify us in a timely manner? These are things that we need to know about, obviously, upfront before we engage and do business. The other things are maybe insurance perspectives, right? If they're using a certain insurance provider, what are they currently using? And then there may be an annual questionnaire and response, a part of that due diligence that we have to go away every year and make sure that they are keeping up to date with security through contractual agreements that allows us obviously to work together, especially when we're having non-public information and it's obviously required to stay non-public or not released in that nature. So we have to make sure that we're doing the right thing as well by the customers and obviously our third parties as well. So that's step two. Step three is our classification. I'll just write this out. And our classification is basically everything based on access that that third party will have to assets, right? And this is typically things around, well, how much access should any third party have either, or, have access to our assets part of their requirements. So, if we have to hire out in our IT services, or if we're outsourcing our IT services, then they would have about 100% access to our data and our assets, which is potentially a higher risk scenario. If we need to ensure that they're obviously doing security correctly, we've got to go away and obviously vet that process and maybe send some security policies, ask for some security policies. Could be maybe data handling, incident response policy. It could be security assurance testing if they've done penetration testing, security assessments. We can ask for these things and obviously ensure that they've got the right insurances as well. So we need to know that they're practicing security correctly and obviously reducing our risks. Therefore, we're going to be happy to ensure that we're obviously doing business with the right partner as well. So um, that's one scenario. So if we've got IT services, maybe the IT service provider that has to have access to our data and assets, which could potentially be a high risk scenario, or maybe a window cleaner, or maybe we have cleaners. Maybe we've got a clean desk policy, for example, and if we have those Windows cleaners, well, if we have those IT assets or more access than maybe getting them to come in and clean the windows, well, then what's the risk of that? So if we have maybe a scheduled outage where they're coming in and doing window cleaning at a certain time, and we have those security controls, maybe like we have to escort them into the building, and obviously someone can maybe stand there or be there with them while they're, cleaning and making sure that they're obviously not lingering around looking in drawers and desks and stuff like that. So there are ways to obviously manage our risk and classify again step three here is classification. And this is ultimately getting to the part where we're going to have to classify the amount of risk associated with obviously doing business with this third party. So that's all about classifying and understanding that in that process. Then as we move on, number four here is the questionnaires. I'm just going to say question for short. And that's all about the request for information, right? This is security policies, security assessments. We want to request the documentation and the policies of, how are you handling your information security? And then this typically maybe can fall under security audit. We can ask for those documentations. And this is pretty important because when they respond, we need to spend time to review and obviously validate that their security is correct and obviously a low risk business. Because should those policies be inaccurate, then obviously down the tracks, things can occur that obviously if we didn't spend time to vet that process now, we can't just blindly decide without doing due diligence and obviously due care that we can put obviously our business and our people that are working with us in a lot of unknown scenarios, right? So, and that's not a good place to be. So we want to ensure that when we're doing our request for informations, we're doing that adequately. We're spending time to go through the questionnaires, vet the process, look at the policies, understand the policies, and understand how obviously they're going to do business with us as well. So that's number four. As we move up the chain, we're going to do the next phase here is our number five, and this is our assess phase. This is where we're going to assess the information. And this is all about, this is typically all proof that they send. We've got to go through it and basically analyze it. So our questionnaires is our request for information. So they send us information. We're now going to review that information again, kind of going through it all, and then determine ultimately, is this company that we're about to do business with too risky? And this is all about vetting that process, right? So that's how we're going to figure it out. And obviously, and if security isn't the only thing, right? It could be financial risks. What happens if maybe a bunch of, the business that we're about to do business with is part of a lawsuit, or, they're reading through a criminal charge, and could be a financial risk, could be a litigation case. It could be things around maybe, if we have all our data running in the cloud of those vendors in the data center and they all go out of business, are they going to notify us? And how do we get our data back? And is it backed up? And, what's the next process from there? So we need to be really aware of the types of risks, not just security, but operational as well, through service level agreements. Maybe, do they have a history of missing SLAs? What impacts would that have to us if they're going to miss our SLAs? And if we've got very strict SLAs, could that be a detrimental component to our business? Things like safety, financial, legal risk. Legal risk is one of the things sometimes that is often underlooked because we don't kind of think of the legal component. You know, Typically, is this going to be an organization again in any lawsuits? Are they in a court hearing or a court proceeding scenario? Um, we need to look into that before we obviously do business and define the requirements and assess that third party and define what level of risk that is obviously to them, but to us as well. So that's all about us assessing the information they're obviously going to send us. And then finally, as we get to the last part of the triangle here is our risk mitigation. And this is, or if you already kind of guessed it, well, all third parties are going to have some risk when we're obviously dealing with them, right? So it's about minimizing that risk and ensuring that we're going to mitigate it or prevent it. And we need to determine, again, how much risk there is by obviously doing business with this third party entity. Um, Now, if there is a level of risk that defines our appetite, or we aren't quite sure, what to do, you know, if there's things that we obviously could consider, right? So if they're coming into this play and we're kind of unsure about the risk, we're unsure about maybe the partner, maybe there's a couple of documents that are missing or don't have information. Well, there's a couple of things to maybe consider when we're about to do business with this third party entity, right? So we can ask the vendor to do something about something, right? So if we've maybe received a document, this is document one, and we're unsure about some questions about it, we can, or maybe we're not sure about the methodology that they've used, or maybe if there's something that we're observing in their environment, we can always have the audacity as a partner to ask them to do something about it, right? We could ask them to maybe complete something, maybe to implement a certain technology. If it's something that we're unsure of in our nature of business, we can always have that ability to ask them to go away and obviously do something about it. If it's compliancy and they have to do maybe an ISO compliance for us to do business with them, we can ask them to go down that ISO path and obviously discuss it and liaise what that risks will look like should they have to go away and complete the ISO requirements, or just using that as an example. So now, if they say no, that I want to go down the ISO path or that I want to listen to you, well, then we don't have to do business with them. So as a requirement, you can just go, no, well, we're not going to obviously work with you. There's the risks that we need to be involved with, and we have to understand what they are. So we don't always have to do work and obviously be blinded into a situation that, we're unsure about. We do have the opinion to say no if we don't want to do business with them, and we can walk away in that matter. We can find a different vendor. We have an opinion and we have a choice that allows us to ensure that we've got confidentiality, there's integrity in our systems, and ensuring that we're managing risk adequately with any third party we end up doing business with. So that's kind of it in a nutshell around our third party risk management lifecycle. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If there's any other questions around third party risk, I'd love to hear it. Love to hear about what you thought about this video as well. And I would just want to say thank you for viewing.